The washout kennels sat behind the Cascade Stock Dog program's main training barn, a row of chain-link runs where dogs that had failed their certification trial waited for transport to the rescue partner that handled pet placement once a dog was judged unfit for ranch work. Callie Dunmore had been coming here for 5 mornings, not to buy. Cascade didn't sell washouts, it surrendered them, and surrendering them was final once the paperwork went through. But to watch, one dog at a time, the way a person watches something they are not yet ready to call a plan. She worked the same way each morning. She would sit on an overturned bucket outside a run, low and quiet, and let a dog come to the fence on its own time instead of calling it over, watching how long it took the animal to settle after the initial excitement of a visitor, whether its eyes tracked the sheep grazing in the side paddock with the tight, low-set focus stockmen called eye, and whether a sudden noise, a gate latch, a truck door, sent the dog into a genuine, lasting spiral of fear or just a startled flinch it shook off within a minute or two. A dog that couldn't recover from a startle at all, that stayed rattled for the rest of a visit, told her something real about its nervous system. A dog that flinched and then settled back into watching the sheep told her something different entirely. She had learned to read a dog this way from her grandfather, Arlo Dunmore's training journals. 6 of them she had found in his tack room the winter after his death, filled with 40 years of notes on working dogs he had started, trained, and placed on ranches across 3 states, using a method built on patience rather than the fixed timeline a trial that formal certification programs like Cascade now relied on. The kennel manager, a young woman named Denise Okafor, who handled intake and transport for Cascade's rescue partner, had stopped asking why Callie came. She would nod from the barn door and go back to processing transport paperwork, and Callie would work down the row of runs, sitting with each washed-out dog in turn, jotting notes in a small notebook, and marking, on a clipboard she kept in her truck, which dogs showed genuine, recoverable instinct beneath whatever had gotten them washed out, and which ones showed something Cascade's own trial had likely read correctly. She had reached the 9th run that Thursday morning, in the cool gray light of October, when Marcus Feld, who had directed the Cascade Stock Dog program for 11 years, came out of the barn office with his coffee and saw her sitting outside the run with a dog named Scout pressed against the fence beside her. Marcus had built Cascade's reputation on a strict, standardized certification trial, a fixed 12-minute window in which a dog had to gather, sort, and pen a set number of sheep cleanly under a judge's stopwatch with a level of composure the program considered non-negotiable for a dog headed to real high-pressure ranch work. Dogs that broke under the trial's time pressure, however promising they looked in ordinary handling, were washed out and surrendered because Marcus had built the program's entire client relationship with working ranches on the promise that a Cascade-certified dog would perform under exactly that kind of pressure, every time, without exception. He looked at Callie now, sitting cross-legged outside Scout's run with the dog's head resting against her knee through the chain link. He said, "Callie, what are you doing out here?" She said, "Sitting with them." "Reading them," he said. "Those are all scheduled for rescue transport by the end of the month." She said, "I know. That's why I'm reading them now, before it's too late to matter." Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Callie Dunmore had grown up in Bridger County, Montana, on a ranch her grandfather Arlo had run for over 40 years and had spent most of her childhood following him through sheep pens and cattle lanes with whatever young dog he had in training that season, watching him work a dog slowly, over weeks rather than days, in a way she hadn't fully understood the value of until she was well into her own adult working life. Callie had gone to work for Cascade herself at 24 as an assistant trainer under Marcus, running dogs through conditioning drills and preliminary stock exposure before they ever reached the formal certification trial, work she was good at and had genuinely believed in for most of her 6 years there. She had been laid off 4 months earlier when Cascade's client base contracted following 2 consecutive dry ranching seasons that left fewer operations able to afford a certified working dog at all, and the program cut its training staff from 5 to 2. She had been picking up part-time farrier assistant work since, living in the house she'd inherited from her grandfather 2 years earlier on his old ranch property, and spending most evenings in a quiet she had not experienced since before the Cascade job began. The layoff had come almost exactly on the 2nd anniversary of Arlo's death, a coincidence Callie had noticed and tried not to read too much into, though it had made that particular winter feel like a second, quieter loss layered on top of the first. She had spent the fall mostly avoiding the tack room, where his gear and notebooks still sat exactly as he'd left them, the way people avoid a room that holds more feeling than they're ready to carry at once, until the Cascade job ended and the days had too much empty space in them to keep avoiding it. She had found Arlo's journals that winter, 6 spiral-bound notebooks in his tack room, going back to the 1970s, filled with his small, deliberate handwriting. Dogs he'd started, sheep and cattle work logged by season, and here and there in the margins, the kind of observation a man writes down because he doesn't want to lose it, even when nobody's paying him to record it. She found the sentence that mattered in the 3rd notebook, dated 1988, in a margin note beside an entry about a dog he'd taken on after another rancher had given up on it. People around here judge a dog on one hard day same as they'd judge a man on his worst day at work, and that's never once been fair to either one. A dog that breaks under a stopwatch on a Tuesday might work stock clean as anything by Friday if you give it 3 quiet days first instead of 1 loud one. I've placed more good working dogs that somebody else already called ruined than I've ever bred and started myself. The instinct's either there or it isn't. Everything else is just nerves, and nerves settle if a man's patient enough to let them. She read it 3 times. She had no way to ask her grandfather exactly which dogs he'd meant, or how many he'd taken in that other trainers had given up on. Because Arlo had been gone 2 years, and most of the men he'd worked alongside were retired or gone themselves. What she had was the sentence. The instinct's either there or it isn't. Everything else is just nerves, and nerves settle if a man's patient enough to let them. She spent the rest of that fall and most of the winter reading everything she could find about working dog temperament assessment, stress recovery in herding breeds, and the difference between a dog that genuinely lacked stock sense and one that simply couldn't perform it under acute time pressure. Not the general training material, most of which assumed a young dog starting fresh rather than one already carrying the memory of a failed trial, but the harder behavioral research on canine stress physiology, on cortisol recovery curves after a startling event, and on how a fixed, high-pressure evaluation window could reliably screen out dogs with a slower physiological reset time even when their underlying working instinct was completely intact. She read about the specific behavioral markers stockmen had long used informally to separate true lack of instinct, a dog that showed no interest in stock at all. No eye, no crouch, no gathering behavior even in a calm, low-pressure setting. From acute stress reactivity, a dog that showed all of that instinct clearly once the noise, the stopwatch, and the unfamiliar judge were taken out of the equation. She read about how long a genuinely capable dog typically needed to settle into new stock and a new handler before its underlying instinct reliably showed through a trial-day nervous overlay, and cross-referenced the timelines against her own 6 years of watching dogs move through Cascade's preliminary training, where she had, more than once, privately suspected a dog washed out on trial day would have passed easily, given even a few more calm exposures first. She was not going to spend months of her own limited time and money on dogs that genuinely lacked the instinct her grandfather's note distinguished as the one thing that couldn't be trained in. She had read and cross-checked her own observations for 2 months before she ever asked Marcus Feld if she could evaluate the washout runs before the rescue transport came. Marcus had said sure, go ahead, though privately he thought she was chasing sentiment over sense. Cascade's entire business model depended on a trial result ranches could trust without question. A dog that needed extra patience to prove itself wasn't a product Cascade could stand behind, whatever its underlying potential. Callie evaluated all 40 washed-out dogs across 5 mornings, sitting with each one in turn, watching startle recovery, watching stock interest in a quiet, unhurried setting, cross-referencing her notes against her grandfather's described markers. Of the 49 showed genuinely no meaningful stock instinct at all, even under calm conditions, dogs better suited to pet homes exactly as Cascade's trial had concluded, and she agreed with that placement without argument. The remaining 31 showed clear eye, clear gathering behavior, and startle recovery times of a minute or less once given a quiet setting without a stopwatch running, exactly the pattern her grandfather's journal had described as fixable nerves rather than missing instinct. She wrote in the notebook she'd started keeping, a 7th volume to sit beside her grandfather's 6 October 19th. 40 washed-out dogs evaluated at Cascade before scheduled rescue transport. 9 show no meaningful stock instinct under any condition. Pet placement is correct for these. 31 show clear instinct and startle recovery under a minute once removed from trial day pressure. Grandfather wrote that instinct is either there or it isn't, and everything else is nerves that settle with patience. Requesting to foster the 31 before transport. Denise Okafor helped her load crates for the 31 dogs into 2 borrowed trailers over the following week without being asked to, and largely without Marcus paying close attention to how many were actually leaving as fosters rather than heading to the rescue partner, because Denise's own father had run cattle dogs on a small operation 2 counties over for most of her childhood, a detail she mentioned almost as an aside while helping load crates. Callie spent that same winter and the following spring working the 31 dogs at her grandfather's old ranch. 1 dog at a time, over rotating 3-day cycles, exactly the unhurried pattern his journals described. Working sheep in a quiet pen with no clock, no judge, and no audience, letting each dog settle into the work at its own pace before asking anything more of it. She logged every session in the notebook the way her grandfather had, tracking which dogs reached clean, confident gathering work within days, and which needed the full patience of a season. The first day with any given dog rarely looked like much. She would simply sit at the pen fence with the dog off-lead nearby, letting it investigate the space, the sheep, and her own presence at whatever pace it chose, intervening only if a dog showed genuine fear-based aggression rather than ordinary caution. The second day, she would walk a small group of calm, dog-broke ewes into the pen and do nothing more than watch, which dog's eyes locked onto the stock with that low, focused intensity her grandfather's notebooks called the tell that couldn't be taught. Only on the third day, once a dog had settled enough to move with purpose, instead of anxiety, would she ask for an actual gather, and even then she asked quietly, without pressure, letting mistakes correct themselves through repetition rather than correction. Some dogs needed exactly 3 days. A handful needed 6 weeks. 1. An older dog named Duke, who had washed out twice at Cascade over 2 separate years, took most of the winter before something in him finally settled enough to work clean, and she wrote his name in the notebook more than any other dog's that season, tracking his slow, uneven progress the way her grandfather had once tracked a dog nobody else had been willing to keep trying with. Word of what Callie was doing reached the feed store in Larkspur before she had finished the first round of evaluations. Denise had mentioned it, offhand, to a delivery driver named Roy Castellan, who stopped by Cascade most mornings. Roy told Ellen Pruitt, who ran the register at the feed store, that Callie Dunmore had taken 31 of Cascade's washed-out dogs and was trying to retrain them into working stock dogs on her grandfather's old ranch. Ellen said, "Washed out means washed out, doesn't it? Cascade doesn't miss much on those trials." Roy said, "That's what I always figured, too." Ellen said, "If Marcus Feld couldn't make those dogs work, I don't see how she's going to." The next customer, a rancher named Gene Wexford, who ran cattle on the ridge above Callie's property and had bought 2 certified dogs from Cascade over the years, had heard a slightly different version by the time he reached the register, one that had gathered more certainty on its way from Roy to Ellen to him. Gene said, "A washed-out dog is a washed-out dog. Cascade's trial is about as rigorous as they come. She's going to end up with a yard full of pets she can't place as working stock, same as the rescue would have." A younger hand who worked seasonally for Gene, standing nearby buying fence wire, said he'd heard Callie had taken all 40 dogs, not 31. And was keeping every one of them regardless of temperament, which he understood to be more sentiment than sound judgment. Ellen said that matched what she'd heard elsewhere. Gene said he hadn't heard that particular detail, but it fit the general shape of what people were saying. By the following week, the story circulating at the feed store had settled into confident, near-universal skepticism, inflated in scale with each retelling and built on genuine respect for Cascade's reputation rather than casual doubt. What was accurate? Callie had taken 31 washed-out dogs to retrain, referring the other 9 appropriately to pet placement. What had drifted? The count and the certainty with which people repeated a claim about Cascade's trial being infallible that treated one high-pressure test day as the final unquestionable word on every dog's underlying working ability, the exact assumption Callie's own grandfather had spent 40 years arguing against. Gene Wexford drove down to Callie's ranch himself on a Saturday in the following spring. Once word had spread that some of her dogs were working sheep cleanly in her pens. He said, "Callie, I heard some of Cascade's washouts are working stock for you now," she said. About 20 of the 31 are running clean gathers and pens at this point. The rest are close, he said. Cascade's trial doesn't miss instinct. If a dog broke on trial day, there's usually a reason. She said, there's a reason, and the reason is a 12-minute window with a stopwatch and a stranger judging, which tells you how a dog handles acute pressure. It doesn't tell you whether the instinct's there underneath it. My grandfather spent 40 years proving those are two different questions, he said. You really think 3 quiet days changes what a dog's actually made of? She said. I think 3 quiet days lets you see what's actually there instead of what a stopwatch scared out of hiding. Come watch one work sheep in my pen and tell me the instinct isn't real. He watched a dog named Scout gather and pen 4 ewes cleanly twice, without a single wasted motion, and stood at the fence a long moment afterward without saying anything. He said, "That's clean work," he said. "I hope the rest of them come along the same way, for your sake." He drove back up the ridge and mentioned the visit at the feed store that evening in a tone considerably less certain than the one he'd used a season earlier. Marcus Feld drove out to Callie's ranch himself the following month, after 2 ranchers he knew had independently mentioned hearing about a former Cascade employee successfully working some of the program's own washouts. He said, "Callie." She said, "Marcus?" He watched her run 2 dogs through a gather and pen sequence, clean, confident, unhurried. He said, "Those were both washouts. I remember Scout specifically. Broke completely on trial day, wouldn't come off the fence line." She said, "He broke under the stopwatch and the judge and the noise of a new place all at once. Give him 3 quiet days with familiar stock and he's been clean every time since." He said, "Cascade's whole business is built on a trial ranches can trust without question. I can't change the format on a program that size overnight." She said, "I'm not asking you to change your program. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to refer future washouts to me before they go to rescue transport, the way you let me look at these. Some of them are placeable as working dogs with a little more patience than a 12-minute trial allows for." He looked at Scout a while longer. He said, "I built this program on the idea that one hard trial tells you everything you need to know about a dog. I've been doing this 11 years, and I'm not sure I've ever actually tested that assumption the way you just did." He agreed to the referral arrangement before he left, on a handshake first and a written agreement the following week. A rancher 2 states over named Priya Ashford, who ran a large sheep operation and had heard about Callie's retrained dogs through a mutual contact at a stock dog trial, drove up that summer to see the dogs work firsthand. She watched 3 of them gather and sort a mixed group of ewes and lambs cleanly under real working conditions, not a formal trial, just an ordinary afternoon's work. She said, "These dogs work like they've been doing this for years, not months." Callie said, "Most of them have the instinct. They just needed patience instead of a stopwatch to prove it." Priya placed an order for 2 dogs on the spot for a training partnership going forward on any future dogs Callie's program produced, and said she knew ranchers in 2 other states who'd want the same. Once word got around, a formal certification program's own washouts were working clean on real operations. Her nephew, 11 years old and living 2 ranches over, had taken to helping most weekend mornings that second year, sitting quietly outside the runs the same patient way his aunt had learned from a notebook, watching a new dog settle before anyone asked anything of it, and had come to the pen fence one Sunday with a question asked the way children ask things, without any preamble at all. He said, "Why did Cascade give up on them? Don't they want the dogs to work too?" Callie said, "They did, but their whole test only gave a dog 12 minutes to prove it on a day with a stranger and a stopwatch and a lot of noise. Some dogs need longer than 12 minutes to show what they can actually do." Nobody at Cascade was wrong to want a fast answer. The dogs just weren't built to give one that quickly. He said, "How did you know to wait?" She said, "Your great-grandfather wrote it down in 1988, 30-some years before I needed to read it, about a dog somebody else had already given up on. I just had to be patient enough to test whether he was right." He thought about this, watching Scout lie calm and alert at the fence line, eyes tracking the sheep in the side paddock. He said, "He looks happy." Callie said, "Yes, he does." That night, after her nephew had gone home and the ranch had gone quiet, under an October evening, Callie sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, her 7th beside her grandfather's 6, and wrote the entry the way she wrote every entry, without embellishment. October, 2nd full season. 26 of the original 31 dogs now placed or working on ranches across 3 states. Formal referral agreement in place with Cascade going forward. Cost of the original dogs, nothing. Cost of the year it took to prove a whole trial format wrong. Everything I had left after the layoff. She read the line back to herself. Then she wrote one more. Started with 40 dogs a 12-minute trial called unemployable. 31 had real instinct underneath the nerves. Grandfather waited his whole career to be right about the difference. I only had to wait 1 season. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside her grandfather's 6, the place in the tack room where things got kept for whoever came next. Then she went out to check the last dog before dark. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told they failed on a day that wasn't a fair measure of what they can actually do. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever given something or someone a second quiet chance after everyone else had already called it finished, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.